The year is 1219. In the heart of Kamakura, Japan's military capital, a woman stands before an assembly of the most powerful samurai in the country. Her head is shaved, she wears the simple robes of a Buddhist nun. She should be invisible, powerless, confined to a monastery, praying for her dead son's souls. That's what women do when their children die. They fade into the background. They disappear into grief. But this woman is not disappearing. Around her, the air is thick with tension. Japan is on the verge of civil war. The shogun, her last surviving son, has just been assassinated on the steps of a shrine. The Minamoto dynasty that her husband built is extinct. The imperial court in Kyoto is circling like vultures, ready to reclaim power. And these samurai, these hardened warriors who have spent their lives mastering the art of violence, are panicking. Everything they've built, everything they've fought for, is about to collapse. Her name is Hojo Masako. History will call her the Nun Shogun, but that title doesn't even begin to capture who she really was. Because Masako didn't just survive in a world designed to silence women. She didn't just influence events from the shadows. She ruled. Openly. Decisively. Ruthlessly. She chose her own husband by running away from an arranged marriage. She outlasted 3 shoguns, 2 emperors, and every man who tried to control her. She helped depose her own son when he threatened her power. She overthrew her father when he became a liability. She delivered a speech so powerful that grown samurai wept and pledged their lives to her cause. And she created a governmental system so effective that her family ruled Japan for over a century after her death. She did it all in a society where women weren't supposed to have any power at all, where women couldn't inherit, where women couldn't rule, where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible. So, how did a provincial lord's daughter become the most powerful person in Japan? How did she outmaneuver every rival, survive every assassination plot, and emerge victorious from decades of brutal medieval politics? What did Masako understand that no one else did? And what price did she pay for power that no woman was supposed to hold? This is the story of Hojo Masako, the woman who ruled Japan while dressed as a nun, the story the history books tried to bury. The story of the most powerful woman you've never heard of. And by the end, you'll understand why her name should be spoken in the same breath as Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, and every other woman who seized power in a world that insisted women were powerless. To understand how Masako became the Nun Shogun, we need to go back to her childhood. To a time before the power, before the palaces, before the assassinations. To a world that was tearing itself apart. And to a girl who was paying very close attention to everything happening around her. The year is 1157. Across Japan, the old order is dying. For nearly 4 centuries, emperors had ruled from Kyoto, living in gilded palaces, composing poetry, and pretending they controlled the country. Real power has shifted to the warrior clans. The samurai families who control the provinces, who command armies, who understand that in the end, politics is just violence by another name. 2 clans dominate everything, the Taira and the Minamoto, and they hate each other with a passion that's about to set Japan on fire. Into this chaos, in the rugged mountains of Isu province, a girl is born. Her father is Hojo Tokimasa, a minor regional lord, a man with more ambition than power. Her name is Masako, which means elegant child. But there's nothing delicate about her destiny. Here's what you need to understand about growing up in provincial Japan during the 1160s. This is not Kyoto. There are no silkscreens hiding aristocratic women from male eyes. There are no poetry competitions where the worst thing that can happen is writing a mediocre verse. This is the frontier. Life is harder. Rules are looser. And women, while still subordinate to men, have more freedom than their city cousins. Masako learns to read and write, which is not universal for girls. She studies Buddhist texts, Chinese classics, Japanese history. But more importantly, she watches. She observes her father navigate the treacherous politics of serving the Taira clan while secretly calculating how to advance his own family's interests. She sees how power works, not through birthright or divine mandate, but through timing, alliances, and the willingness to betray before you're betrayed. She's learning lessons that will save her life dozens of times in the decades ahead. But she doesn't know that yet. Right now, she's just a girl in a remote province, watching the world burn, and burn it does. In 1160, when Masako is just 3 years old, the Heiji rebellion erupts in Kyoto. The Minamoto clan launches a coup attempt against the Taira-backed government. It fails spectacularly. The Minamoto leader, Yoshitomo, is killed while fleeing, and the Taira, led by the ruthless Taira no Kiyomori, spend the next several years hunting down every male Minamoto they can find and executing them. This is not metaphorical. This is systematic extermination. Yoshitomo's adult sons are beheaded. His teenage sons are killed. The Taira are trying to erase the Minamoto bloodline from history. But they make one mistake. One small, seemingly insignificant decision that will change everything. They spare one boy. Yoshitomo's son, Yoritomo, who is just 13 years old. Some Taira official, whose name is lost to history, decides that killing a child is too cruel, even for them. So instead of execution, they choose exile. They send the boy to the most remote place they can think of, the mountains of Izu province, to live under the supervision of a minor lord who will watch him carefully and ensure he never becomes a threat. That minor lord is Hojo Tokimasa, Masako's father. So Yoritomo arrives in Izu as essentially a prisoner. He's 13, traumatized, the last heir of a destroyed clan. He's given a small residence, minimal support, and the very clear understanding that his life depends on staying quiet, staying humble, never trying to reclaim what his family lost. 20 years pass. Yoritomo grows from a boy into a man, spending his 20s and early 30s in obscurity, powerless, watching the Taira consolidate their control over Japan. He's going nowhere. He has no prospects, no future, no hope. And then, in 1177, something happens that nobody expects. He meets Masako. Picture this scene. It's sometime in 1177 or early 1178. Masako is 20 years old, which by the standards of her time makes her practically a spinster. Most noble women marry at 14 or 15. But Masako's father hasn't found the right match yet, the right alliance that will advance the Hojo family's interests. Yoritomo is 30, middle-aged by medieval standards, an exiled nobody living under constant surveillance. And somehow, despite everything, despite her father's oversight, despite Yoritomo being essentially a prisoner, they begin a relationship. The historical record doesn't tell us how they first met. It doesn't tell us who made the first move, what they talked about, whether this was love or calculation, or both. All we know is this. Masako made a choice, and it was the most dangerous, most defiant choice of her life. Think about what she's risking. Yoritomo has nothing. He's the heir to a dead clan, a man with no power, no prospects, no future beyond staying alive in exile. Any sensible woman, any woman concerned with security and status and not becoming a political liability to her family, would avoid him. But Masako sees something others don't. Maybe it's his intelligence. Maybe it's his burning ambition, carefully hidden but never extinguished. Maybe she understands something about the nature of political fortune, that nothing lasts forever, that the defeated heir of today could become the conquering hero of tomorrow. Or maybe, and this is what makes Masako so fascinating, she simply wants him. Maybe she looks at the political marriages around her, the loveless alliances, the women traded like cattle to advance their father's interests, and she decides she will choose for herself. Whatever her reasoning, she chooses Yoritomo. And when her father finds out, he loses his mind. Tokimasa tries everything to separate them. He forbids Masako from seeing Yoritomo. He arranges another marriage for her, to a man named Yamaki Kanataka, a provincial official who can actually advance the Hojo family's interests. There's a ceremony. Masako is formally married to this man she doesn't want, this man she never chose. And then, on her wedding night, Masako does something that would be shocking in any era, but in 12th century Japan is almost unthinkable. She runs away. She escapes from her wedding, goes directly to Yoritomo, and makes it absolutely clear that she will not be married to anyone except him. She has defied her father, humiliated her new husband, rejected an arranged marriage, and chosen her own path. This is not how things work in medieval Japan. Women do not choose their husbands. Women do not run away from marriages their fathers arrange. Women certainly do not force their families to accept their decisions through sheer act of will. But Masako just did exactly that. Tokimasa is furious. The insult to Yamaki Kanataka is severe. The scandal threatens the Hojo family's reputation. He could punish Masako, lock her up, continue fighting this battle. But Tokimasa is also, above all else, a realist. He looks at his stubborn daughter and her exiled lover, and he makes a calculation. Yoritomo is powerless now, yes, but he's still technically the heir to the Minamoto. If, and this is an enormous if, the political situation ever changes, if the Taira dominance ever weakens, having Yoritomo as a son-in-law might not be the worst outcome. So he accepts it, grudgingly, with significant reservations, but he accepts it. In 1180, Yoritomo and Masako are formally married. She's 23, considered old for a first marriage. He's 33, an exile with nothing but a famous name and dreams of revenge. They should have lived out their lives in obscurity. They should have grown old in Izu, had children, faded into historical footnotes. But then, just months after their wedding, everything changes. In April 1180, an imperial prince named Mochihito does something extraordinary. He issues a secret decree calling on all the warrior clans of Japan to rise up and destroy the Taira. It's treason. It's rebellion. It's a death sentence for anyone who answers the call. Yoritomo answers the call. Within weeks, he's raising an army. Within months, he's launched a full-scale rebellion against the Taira. After 20 years of exile, 20 years of humiliation, 20 years of watching and waiting, Yoritomo is going to war. And Masako, the woman who chose an exile with no prospects, has just become the wife of a rebel leader who's either about to conquer Japan or die trying. Her father, Tokimasa, makes a decision that will define the next 50 years of Japanese history. He joins the rebellion. He brings the Hojo clan's forces to support his son-in-law. Masako's marriage, the marriage her father had opposed, has just become the most important political alliance in eastern Japan. She was right to choose Yoritomo, and now everyone knows it. But being right doesn't mean being safe. What follows next is 5 years of brutal civil war that will kill tens of thousands, destroy ancient clans, and remake Japan forever. And Masako is about to discover that surviving a war is just as difficult as winning one. The Genpei War. That's what historians call the 5-year bloodbath that followed Yoritomo's rebellion. But those two words don't capture the reality. They don't capture the terror of watching armies march toward your home. They don't capture the smell of burning villages. They don't capture what it's like to live in constant fear that today might be the day your side loses and everyone you love is executed. Masako lived through all of it, and she didn't just survive, she thrived. While Yoritomo commanded armies in the field, Masako did something equally important. She built the political infrastructure that would support those armies. She managed correspondence with potential allies. She met with regional lords, convincing them to join the Minamoto cause. She organized supply lines, ensuring that Yoritomo's forces had food, weapons, and equipment. And she had children, 4 of them, born during a civil war. 2 daughters, Ohaime and Sanman. 2 sons, Yorie and Sanatomo. Can you imagine that? Giving birth while your husband is fighting battles that could get him killed at any moment? Raising children while knowing that if your side loses, those children will be executed as traitors? But here's what's remarkable. Masako didn't hide. She didn't retreat to some safe location and wait for the war to end. She stayed at the center of power. In Kamakura, the city Yoritomo established as his base of operations. She was visible, active, increasingly recognized as someone whose opinion mattered. The war itself was brutal and transformative. The Taira and Minamoto fought dozens of major battles. Entire armies were destroyed, cities burned, thousands died. But slowly, methodically, the Minamoto gained the upper hand. Yoritomo wasn't the best general in the family. That distinction belonged to his younger brother, Yoshitsune, a military genius who won stunning victories against impossible odds. Battle after battle, Yoshitsune proved himself to be perhaps the greatest tactical commander of his generation. But Yoritomo was the better politician. He understood something Yoshitsune didn't. Wars are won on battlefields, but power is secured through institutions, through administrative systems, through creating structures that outlast individual victories. While Yoshitsune was winning battles, Yoritomo was building a government. He created administrative offices, established courts, organized tax collection, and most importantly, he built a power base that was separate from Kyoto, separate from the old imperial system, separate from everything that had come before. And Masako was right there with him, helping build that system. Not officially, women couldn't hold administrative positions, but in practice, she was one of Yoritomo's most trusted advisors. She met with samurai lords. She offered political counsel. She became, increasingly, the second most important person in the Minamoto camp. By 1185, the war was over. The final Taira forces were destroyed at the Battle of Dan no Ura, a massive naval engagement where the Taira fleet was annihilated. The child emperor the Taira had installed committed suicide by drowning. The Taira clan was effectively extinct. Yoritomo had won. The Minamoto were triumphant, and Masako, the woman who had chosen an exile with no prospects, was now the wife of the most powerful man in Japan. She was 28 years old. She had survived a civil war. She had 4 children. She had helped build a new government. And now came the hard part. Because winning a war is actually easier than maintaining peace. On the battlefield, your enemies are in front of you, easy to identify. In peacetime, your enemies surround you, smiling, pretending to be allies, waiting for the moment to strike. Masako was about to learn this lesson the hard way, and it would cost her almost everything. If you're still watching, you're clearly invested in Masako's story. You want to know what happens next. How does a woman maintain power in a world designed to strip it away? How does she navigate palace intrigue that would destroy lesser politicians? And what terrible choices will she have to make? Hit that like button if this story is keeping you hooked. Because what happens in the next chapter is where Masako stops being just a survivor and becomes something more dangerous. A player. A power broker. A woman willing to sacrifice anything, even family, to hold on to what she's built. The war was over. But the real fight was just beginning. Yoritomo's victory in the Genpei War made him the most powerful warrior in Japan. But it didn't make him shogun. Not yet. That would take another 7 years of political maneuvering. First, Yoritomo had to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and create a governmental structure that would endure. And this is where things get dark. Where the story stops being about heroic rebellion and starts being about the brutal mechanics of holding power. Because Yoritomo, for all his political brilliance, was also deeply paranoid. He trusted almost no one. He saw potential threats everywhere, in the eyes of former allies, in the ambitions of rival clans, even in his own family. The first victim was his brother, Yoshitsune. Remember Yoshitsune, the military genius who won the war's most important battles? The brilliant general beloved by troops and celebrated in songs? The man who, in many ways, was more popular than Yoritomo himself? That popularity made him dangerous. Yoritomo began turning on Yoshitsune almost immediately after the war ended. He accused his brother of accepting court appointments without permission, of acting independently, of building a personal power base. These accusations weren't entirely false, but they weren't the real issue. The real issue was simple and terrifying. Yoshitsune was too capable, too popular, too much of a potential rival. In 1185, just months after the war ended, Yoritomo declared Yoshitsune an outlaw. He sent armies to hunt him down. Yoshitsune fled, desperately seeking allies, trying to survive. But there was no escape. Every lord in eastern Japan knew that helping Yoshitsune meant becoming Yoritomo's enemy. By 1189, Yoshitsune was cornered in northern Japan. Rather than be captured and humiliated, he committed suicide, killing his wife and young daughter before taking his own life. The greatest general of his generation, a war hero. Yoritomo's own brother, dead because he was too successful. And Masako watched all of this happen. She lived in the same compound as Yoritomo. She knew what he was doing. She understood that Yoshitsune was being destroyed, not for treason, but for being too talented. And she said nothing. This is where we need to pause and understand something crucial about Masako. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't fighting for justice or equality or some noble cause. She was fighting for survival and power in a world where weakness meant death. Yoshitsune alive was a threat to Yoritomo's dominance. Yoshitsune dead was just a tragic memory. It was brutal logic, but it was sound logic. And Masako understood it perfectly. This was a defining moment. Masako learned that loyalty to family, even loyalty to a war hero brother-in-law, meant nothing compared to political survival. She learned that in the game of power, sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford. It was a lesson she would apply again and again in the years ahead. With devastating consequences, with Yoshitsune eliminated, Yoritomo turned his attention to building something unprecedented in Japanese history. A military government, a bakufu, that would operate independently of the imperial court. A system where power came not from aristocratic bloodlines or divine appointment, but from military strength and samurai loyalty. He established his capital in Kamakura, not Kyoto. This was revolutionary. For centuries, political power had been centered in Kyoto, where the emperor lived. But Yoritomo wanted distance from the imperial court, from the old aristocracy, from the ceremonial politics he viewed as corrupt and ineffective. In Kamakura, Yoritomo created administrative offices, established courts for samurai, organized military units, and built a governmental structure that was entirely new. It was the beginning of what would become 7 centuries of samurai rule in Japan. And in 1192, 7 years after the war ended, the emperor finally granted Yoritomo the title he'd been waiting for, shogun, supreme military commander, generalissimo. In theory, the shogun served the emperor. In practice, the shogun was the real ruler, and the emperor was a ceremonial figurehead living in a palace in Kyoto, surrounded by poetry and incense, completely irrelevant to actual governance. Yoritomo had achieved everything. He'd gone from exiled prisoner to the most powerful man in Japan. He'd created a new form of government. He'd established a dynasty. And Masako was right there with him. Not as shogun, women couldn't hold that title, but as the shogun's wife. And in that role, she wielded enormous influence. She met with samurai lords who came to petition Yoritomo. She advised on appointments, on policy, on strategy. She managed the vast household that was also the administrative center of government. And increasingly, people recognized a simple reality. To get to Yoritomo, you had to go through Masako first. But here's what nobody saw coming. All of Yoritomo's paranoia, all his ruthlessness, all the enemies he'd made and allies he'd destroyed. It created a system that was powerful but fragile, a system held together by one man's will and one man's authority. What would happen when that man died? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. And when it did, Masako would face the greatest test of her life. In January 1199, Yoritomo went on a routine inspection tour. He was 51 years old, still relatively young, still vigorous, still very much in control. He was riding his horse, conducting ordinary business, and then something happened. The historical record is frustratingly unclear. Some sources say he fell from his horse. Others suggest he suffered a stroke or seizure. Some even whisper about poison, about enemies finally catching up with him. Whatever the cause, Yoritomo never recovered. He fell into a coma and died within weeks. The shogun was dead. The man who had built everything, who had conquered Japan, who had created a new form of government, was gone. And Masako, at 42 years old, was suddenly a widow in a political system that had no place for widows in power. This should have been the end of her story. In Japanese tradition, when a woman's husband died, she was expected to take Buddhist vows, shave her head, become a nun, and spend the rest of her life in prayer and mourning. She was supposed to remove herself from worldly affairs, from politics, from power. It was not a choice. It was expectation. It was how things were done. And Masako did take those vows. She shaved her head. She put on the simple robes of a Buddhist nun. She adopted the religious name Amida Butsu. She withdrew to a monastery, ostensibly to pray for Yoritomo's soul. Everyone assumed this was the end. Masako was gone. The shogunate would pass to Yoritomo's heir, their 18-year-old son Yorie, and the Hojo clan would fade back into the background, grateful for the power they'd had, accepting that it was over. Everyone assumed wrong, because what nobody understood, what nobody saw coming, was that becoming a nun didn't make Masako powerless. If anything, it made her more dangerous than she'd ever been before, and she was about to prove it. When Yoritomo died, Masako did exactly what was expected. She shaved her head, took Buddhist vows, and became a nun. This was not optional. This was the only socially acceptable path for a samurai widow, especially one of her rank. But here's what everyone missed. Becoming a nun did not mean becoming powerless. Taking Buddhist vows gave Masako something unexpected. It gave her freedom. As a nun, she was no longer bound by the expectations placed on wives. She was outside the normal social hierarchy. She could meet with men without chaperones. She could travel. She could speak in public gatherings. She could, if she was clever enough, wield influence that would have been inappropriate for any other woman. And Masako was very clever. She took the religious name Amida Butsu, the nun who invokes Amida Buddha. But she did not retire to a distant monastery to pray in silence. She stayed in Kamakura. She stayed at the center of power, and she immediately began positioning herself as the power behind her son's throne. Here's the thing about Masako that made her different from every other woman in medieval Japan. She understood that power doesn't come from titles or official positions. It comes from being the person everyone needs to consult, from being the one who knows where all the bodies are buried, from being indispensable. Yorie, Masako's eldest son, was 17 years old when he became shogun. He was technically an adult by the standards of the time, but he was inexperienced, impulsive, and completely unprepared for the political complexities he faced. The samurai lords who had served his father were now watching carefully to see if the young shogun could command their respect. The imperial court in Kyoto was looking for any sign of weakness that might allow them to reclaim power. And within Kamakura itself, rival families were already maneuvering, already calculating whether Yorie could hold what his father had built. Yorie needed guidance. He needed advisors. He needed someone who understood the political landscape, who knew which samurai could be trusted and which were waiting for an opportunity to betray him. He needed his mother, but there was a problem. Masako was not the only person trying to control the young shogun. There was also her father, Hojo Tokimasa. Tokimasa, now in his 60s, had been a key supporter of Yoritomo from the beginning. He had joined the rebellion when it was far from certain to succeed. He had risked everything for his son-in-law. And now, with Yoritomo dead and his grandson as shogun, Tokimasa saw an opportunity. He wanted to be regent. He wanted to be the official power behind the throne. the man who made the real decisions, while the young shogun provided legitimacy. And Masako wanted the same thing. But what nobody expected was that mother and daughter would soon be facing off against each other's vision for Japan's future. Because the one thing they couldn't agree on was how to control a young man who was beginning to realize he had power of his own. This created a complicated dynamic. Mother and grandfather working together, but also competing. Allied, but also rivals. United in their desire to control Yorie, but divided over who would ultimately hold power. For a while, they worked in tandem. Tokimasa was named head of the Council of State, the main administrative body of the Bakufu. Masako operated more informally, advising her son, managing the household, meeting with samurai lords. But young Yorie was not content to be a puppet. He was Yoritomo's son. He had inherited his father's ambition, if not, his father's patience and political acumen, and he began to chafe under the constant oversight of his mother and grandfather. Yorie started making his own appointments, his own decisions. He promoted his wife's family, the Hiki clan, giving them positions of power. He began to rely on their advice, rather than his mother's. He distanced himself from the Hojo. This was a disaster in the making. Because the one thing Masako and Tokimasa agreed on was this: the Hojo clan had to remain dominant. They had risked everything for Yoritomo. They had built this government, and they would not allow anyone, not even the shogun himself, to push them aside. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Masako. Because what she does next isn't heroic. It's not noble. It's not even morally defensible by any normal standard. It's purely, coldly, brutally political. And it will cost her something that no amount of power can replace. In 1203, just 4 years into Yorie's reign, the situation came to a head. Yorie fell seriously ill. The exact nature of his illness is unclear. Some sources suggest it was genuine, a fever or infection. Others hint at poison. Whatever the cause, Yorie was incapacitated. And Tokimasa and Masako saw their opportunity. They moved quickly. While Yorie lay sick, possibly dying, they announced that power would be divided. Yorie's younger brother, Sanetomo, just 11 years old, would become ko-shogun, governing part of the territory. If Yorie died, Sanetomo would become sole shogun. This was a coup. A bloodless coup, for the moment, but a coup nonetheless. They were stripping Yorie of power, while he was too weak to resist. But then Yorie recovered. He woke up to find that his authority had been divided, that his younger brother was now ko-shogun, that his mother and grandfather had betrayed him. He was furious, and he began planning revenge. Imagine being 18 years old, lying in bed recovering from an illness, and discovering that your own mother has just stolen half your power. Not your enemies, not rival clans, your mother. Yorie was young and impulsive, but he was not stupid. He understood that his mother and grandfather were the real threat to his authority. He understood that as long as they lived, he would never truly rule. So he decided to have them killed. He conspired with his wife's family, the Hiki clan, to assassinate Tokimasa. The plan was simple: invite Tokimasa to a meeting, ambush him, kill him, and then move against Masako and anyone else who had supported the division of the shogunate. It should have worked. Tokimasa was old. He would be vulnerable, and with him dead, the Hojo clan would be leaderless. But Yorie made a critical mistake. He underestimated his mother. Masako had spies everywhere. She had spent years building a network of informants, allies, and supporters among the samurai of Kamakura. And when whispers of Yorie's plot reached her, she acted immediately. She went to her father and warned him. Then she made a decision that would define the rest of her life and the future of Japan. She chose her father over her son. Let that sink in for a moment. A mother choosing to betray her own child, not in some abstract political sense, but literally choosing to help destroy her son's attempt to survive against the very people who had stolen his power. It's worth pausing here to understand what this meant. In any society, but especially in Confucian-influenced Japan. The bond between mother and son was supposed to be sacred. A mother was expected to protect her children above all else, to sacrifice everything for their well-being. But Masako was not governed by sentiment. She was governed by political calculation. And the political calculation was clear. Yorie was unstable, impulsive, and dangerous. He was trying to murder his own grandfather. He was conspiring against the very family that had put him in power. If he succeeded, the Hojo would be destroyed. And if the Hojo were destroyed, the entire Kamakura government might collapse into civil war. Masako could not allow that. What happened next was brutal and swift. In September 1203, before Yorie could execute his plot, Tokimasa struck first. Hojo forces surrounded the compound of the Hiki clan. What followed was a massacre. Yorie's father-in-law, mother-in-law, and most of his wife's family were killed. The Hiki clan was effectively annihilated. Yorie, still shogun, was powerless to stop it. His allies were dead. His plot was exposed. He was completely isolated, and then Masako and Tokimasa delivered the final blow. They forced Yorie to abdicate. They stripped him of the title of shogun and placed him under house arrest. His younger brother, Sanetomo, still just 11 years old, became the sole shogun. Yorie, bewildered and defeated, was sent to a monastery, not as a willing monk seeking enlightenment, but as a prisoner. He was 18 years old. He had been shogun for 4 years, and now his own mother had helped depose him. But the story doesn't end there. Because even in confinement, Yorie was dangerous. He was the legitimate heir. He had supporters, people who believed he was the rightful shogun. As long as he lived, he was a rallying point for anyone unhappy with Hojo dominance. And what happened next still haunts Japanese history. 6 months after his abdication, in July 1204, Yorie was murdered. Officially, he died of illness. But everyone knew the truth. He was assassinated, almost certainly on Tokimasa's orders. Masako's eldest son, the boy she had raised, was dead, killed by her own family, with her knowledge, possibly even with her approval. There is no record of how Masako reacted to her son's death. No diary entry, no letter, no witness account of her grief or guilt or justification. All we know is this: she did not protest. She did not seek revenge. She did not withdraw from politics or demand accountability. She stayed in Kamakura. She continued to advise her younger son, Sanetomo. She continued to work with her father. She continued to consolidate Hojo power. Whatever she felt about Yorie's death, she kept it to herself, and she moved forward. This is the part of Masako's story that makes people uncomfortable. Because, up until this point, it's easy to admire her. She chose her own husband. She defied convention. She survived in a brutal political world. She was intelligent, capable, resilient. But this, allowing, possibly even supporting, the murder of her own son? This crosses a line that makes her something other than a simple hero. It makes her human, complicated, morally ambiguous. It makes her a politician in the truest sense. Someone willing to sacrifice anything, even family, for power and stability. And it's precisely this ruthlessness that made her one of the most effective rulers in Japanese history. But if you think that was the darkest moment of Masako's life, you're wrong, because she was about to do something even more shocking. She was about to betray the man who had protected her from childhood. The man who had risked everything to support her marriage. Her own father, with Yorie dead and the 12-year-old Sanetomo as shogun, the Hojo clan was now firmly in control of Japan. But this control was not complete. There were still threats, still rivals, still people who resented Hojo dominance and were looking for opportunities to challenge it. And Masako understood that her family's power was far from secure. The biggest problem was legitimacy. Sanetomo was shogun in name, but he was a child. Everyone knew the real power was held by Tokimasa and Masako. And while many samurai accepted this arrangement, others bristled at being ruled by regents rather than a true warrior leader. There were also rival families within the Kamakura government. The Miura clan, the Hatakeyama, the Wada. These were powerful samurai families who had fought in the Genpei War, who had their own armies and their own ambitions. They had accepted Minamoto leadership because Yoritomo had been an extraordinary leader. But they were less enthusiastic about serving a child shogun controlled by the Hojo. Masako spent the next several years working to neutralize these threats. She did not do this through military action. She did it through politics, manipulation, and strategic marriages. She arranged marriage alliances between Hojo daughters and sons and the heirs of potential rival families. This created blood ties that made betrayal more difficult. She supported samurai who were loyal to the Hojo, giving them appointments and rewards. She isolated those who were not, cutting them off from patronage and influence. And she cultivated a personal following among the Kamakura samurai. She held audiences, heard petitions, mediated disputes. She became known as someone who was fair in her judgments, who listened to complaints, who understood the concerns of the warrior class. This was remarkable. Remember, Masako was a woman in a society that did not officially give women political authority. But she was building a reputation, a personal power base that was independent of any man. The samurai were not following her because she was the shogun's mother or because she was Tokimasa's daughter. They were following her because they respected her judgment and believed she understood their interests. This personal loyalty would become critical in the years ahead, because Masako was about to face her greatest challenge yet, and it would require her to do something that even her enemies wouldn't have predicted. She was about to overthrow her own father. But while Masako was building her power base, her father was making mistakes. Tokimasa, growing older and more paranoid, began to see threats everywhere. He started to turn on his own allies, just as Yoritomo had done before him. In 1205, Tokimasa decided that the Hatakeyama family, one of the Kamakura government's founding families, had become too powerful. He accused them of plotting against the shogunate. Without sufficient evidence, without even consulting Masako, he ordered their destruction. The Hatakeyama were attacked and annihilated. It was brutal, unnecessary, and politically damaging. Other samurai families watched and wondered, if Tokimasa would turn on the Hatakeyama without cause, might they be next? Masako was horrified. She understood, as her father apparently did not, that power based purely on fear and violence was unsustainable. You could eliminate rivals, yes, but you also needed allies. You needed people who supported you willingly, not just out of terror. She confronted her father, trying to convince him to moderate his approach. But Tokimasa would not listen. He was the head of the Hojo clan. He was the power behind the shogun. Who was Masako to question him? And then Tokimasa made his biggest mistake. He decided to depose Sanetomo and replace him with a different shogun, a son-in-law of his own second wife. It was a naked power grab, an attempt to replace the Minamoto shogunate with a Hojo puppet from a different family entirely. It was also political insanity. Sanetomo, young as he was, had legitimacy as Yoritomo's son. Any replacement would be seen as illegitimate. The samurai would rebel. The imperial court would withdraw recognition. The entire Kamakura system would collapse. Masako tried to stop her father. She argued, she pleaded. She warned him that this plan would destroy everything they had built. But Tokimasa was determined. So Masako did the only thing she could do. She betrayed her father. Think about that for a moment. She'd already betrayed her son, and now she was about to betray the man who had raised her, who had supported her marriage to Yoritomo when no one else would, who had risked everything to join the rebellion. But here's what you need to understand about Masako. She wasn't motivated by cruelty or power lust. She was motivated by something more fundamental: survival. The survival of the system she and Yoritomo had built. The survival of the Hojo clan. the survival of everything she'd spent 25 years creating. In 1205, Masako went to her brother, Hojo Yoshitoki. Yoshitoki was Tokimasa's eldest son, next in line to lead the Hojo clan. She told him about their father's plan. She convinced him that Tokimasa had to be stopped, and then, together, they staged a coup against their own father. They mobilized their supporters among the Kamakura samurai. They surrounded Tokimasa's residence, and they forced him, at sword point, to retire. Not killed, not executed, but removed from power and sent to a monastery. Tokimasa, the man who had helped build the Kamakura Bakufu, who had fought alongside Yoritomo, who had been Masako's father and protector, was overthrown by his own children. Yoshitoki became the new head of the Hojo clan. And Masako, the nun who was not supposed to have any political power, had just orchestrated the removal of the most powerful man in Japan. Let's be clear about what just happened. Masako had now helped depose or remove both her eldest son and her father. She had chosen political stability over family loyalty twice. She had proven that she would sacrifice anyone, destroy anyone, who threatened the system she was building. Some historians paint this as ruthless ambition. Others argue it was pragmatic necessity, that both Yorie and Tokimasa had become too dangerous, too unstable, and that removing them prevented civil wars that would have killed thousands. Both interpretations are probably true. Masako was ambitious. She wanted power, but she also genuinely believed that the Kamakura system, with Hojo guidance and Minamoto legitimacy, was the best hope for Japan's stability. And she was willing to do terrible things to preserve that stability. With Tokimasa gone, the political dynamic shifted. Yoshitoki became the official regent, the shikin, the man who governed in the shogun's name. But everyone knew that Masako was the real power. She was Yoshitoki's elder sister. She had far more political experience. She had the respect of the samurai, and she had proven, repeatedly, that she was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain control. Brother and sister worked together. Yoshitoki handled military matters and formal administration. Masako handled politics, diplomacy, and the delicate work of keeping the samurai lords loyal. It was an effective partnership. But it also created an unusual situation. Japan now had an official ruler, the emperor in Kyoto, who had no real power. A shogun, Sanetomo, who was a figurehead controlled by regents. A regent, Yoshitoki, who nominally held power. And a nun, Masako, who actually made most of the important decisions. This system worked, not because it was elegant or traditional, but because Masako made it work through sheer force of personality and political skill. But what nobody saw coming was that this fragile balance was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. Because Masako's last surviving son was about to be murdered. And when that happened, everything she'd built would hang by a thread. Young Sanetomo was growing up. By his late teens, he was beginning to assert himself. But unlike his brother Yorie, Sanetomo was not interested in political power. He was interested in poetry. Sanetomo became one of the finest poets of his generation. He wrote in the classical waka style, composing verses about nature, love, impermanence, and the sadness of existence. His poetry was genuinely excellent, praised by the Kyoto aristocrats who normally looked down on provincial samurai culture. But poetry does not command armies. Poetry does not maintain political alliances. Poetry does not keep ambitious samurai lords in line. So Masako let her son write his poems. She encouraged it, even. And while he composed verses about cherry blossoms and autumn leaves, she ran Japan. It's tempting to see this as sad. A young man trapped in a role he never wanted, finding solace in art while his mother wielded his authority. And there's truth to that. Sanetomo was a sensitive soul in a brutal world, a poet forced to play the role of warrior. But it's also possible that this arrangement suited everyone. Sanetomo got to pursue his passion without the burden of actual governance. Masako got to exercise power without the constraints that would have come from having a strong-willed shogun. The samurai got stability and effective leadership. For more than a decade, from 1205 to 1219, this system functioned remarkably well. The Kamakura Bakufu strengthened its control over Japan. The imperial court in Kyoto remained ceremonial. The samurai class prospered. There were no major wars, no catastrophic famines, no widespread rebellions. Masako was now in her 50s, an age when most people of her era were already dead or infirm. But she remained sharp, active, and utterly in control. And then, in 1219, tragedy struck again. This time, it would be so devastating that even Masako's legendary political skills would be pushed to their absolute limit. Sanetomo, now 27 years old, went to Tsurugaoka Hachiman Shrine for a ceremony. It was a routine event, the kind of ceremonial appearance that shoguns made regularly. He was accompanied by guards, attendants, all the usual protocols. But someone had been planning. Someone had been waiting. Someone who had been nursing a hatred that had festered for 16 years. As Sanetomo descended the steps of the shrine, a figure emerged from behind a massive ginkgo tree. It was a young monk, his face twisted with rage and vengeance. The monk drew a sword and charged. Before anyone could react, the monk struck. Once, twice, 3 times. Sanetomo fell, blood pouring from his wounds. He died within minutes. Murdered on the steps of a sacred shrine, killed by the one person no one had suspected. The assassin was Kugyo, Yorie's son, Masako's grandson. Kugyo had been just a child when his father was deposed and murdered. He had been forced to become a monk, his life destroyed before it began. And he had spent more than 15 years nursing his hatred, waiting for his chance, planning his revenge. He had killed Sanetomo, the shogun, his own uncle. And in doing so, he had murdered the last legitimate heir of the Minamoto clan, the last direct descendant of Yoritomo. Kugyo was captured immediately and executed within hours. But the damage was done. Sanetomo was dead, and with him died the Minamoto shogunate. Masako was now 62 years old. She had lost her husband to illness, her eldest son to political necessity, and now her youngest son to assassination by her own grandson. 3 men she had loved, all dead. The Minamoto line, the family she had married into, the dynasty she had helped build, was extinct. Any normal person would have been destroyed by this. Any normal person would have withdrawn into genuine religious contemplation, overwhelmed by grief, broken by loss. But Masako was not any normal person, because what she did next would become the most famous moment in her entire life. A single speech that would save Japan from civil war and cement her legend forever. With Sanetomo dead and no Minamoto heir available, the shogunate faced a legitimacy crisis. Who would be shogun now? Without a direct descendant of Yoritomo, what gave Kamakura the right to rule Japan? The imperial court in Kyoto saw an opportunity. They suggested that perhaps, with the Minamoto line extinct, power should return to Kyoto. Perhaps the emperor should resume actual governance. Perhaps the whole Kamakura experiment should end. The samurai lords of eastern Japan began to panic. If the imperial court regained power, they would lose their positions, their lands, their influence. Many of them owed everything to the Kamakura system. If it collapsed, they were ruined. The situation was spiraling toward potential civil war. Different factions were forming. The whole carefully balanced system that Masako had spent 2 decades building was on the verge of collapse. And that's when Masako delivered the most famous speech in Japanese medieval history. In the summer of 1219, just months after Sanetomo's assassination, Masako called an assembly. She summoned all the major samurai lords, all the important officials, everyone who mattered in the Kamakura government. They came, these hardened warriors, these men who had spent their lives fighting, killing, building their power through violence. They came to hear what the nun, the widow, the bereaved mother had to say. And Masako, dressed in her simple nun's robes, her head shaved, her face marked by age and grief, stood before them, and spoke. The exact words have been recorded in the Azuma Kagami, the official chronicle of the Kamakura Bakufu. Historians debate the precise translation, but the essence is clear. My dear warriors, you have not forgotten the debt you owe to my late husband, have you? When the Taira clan ruled with arrogance and cruelty, when justice had been abandoned, when the warrior class was oppressed, my husband raised his army of righteousness. He overthrew tyranny. He established a government that respected your rights, that gave you justice, that allowed you to prosper. You owe everything to him. Your lands, your positions, your honor. All of it comes from his struggle, from his vision, from his sacrifice. And now, in his absence, there are those who would destroy what he built. There are those in Kyoto who believe that, with the Minamoto line extinct, they can reclaim power. They think you will simply submit. They think you will abandon everything my husband gave you and return to the old system where you were nothing. Will you allow this? Will you betray the memory of the man who made you what you are? Will you abandon the Bakufu that has given you justice and security? Or will you stand together? Will you defend what you have built? Will you prove that the warrior class does not need a Minamoto heir to govern with justice and strength? It was a masterpiece of rhetoric. Masako invoked Yoritomo's memory, appealing to loyalty and gratitude. She reminded the samurai of what they had gained under the Kamakura system and what they would lose if it fell. She turned a crisis of legitimacy into a test of honor. And most brilliantly, she made it about them. She didn't say, support the Hojo. She said, support the system that benefits you. She made them feel that they were defending their own interests, not just serving her family. The response was overwhelming. The samurai wept. Grown men, warriors who had killed in battle, cried openly as Masako spoke. They pledged their loyalty. They swore to defend Kamakura, to preserve the Bakufu, to stand against anyone, even the emperor himself, who threatened what they had built. This speech saved the Kamakura government. It prevented civil war. It established that the shogunate would continue even without a Minamoto heir. And it demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that Masako was the true ruler of Japan. The imperial court, seeing the unity Masako had created, backed down. They accepted that Kamakura would continue to govern. A nominal shogun was found, a child from the imperial family with distant Minamoto connections, but everyone knew he was a puppet. The real power remained where it had been for years, with Masako and her brother Yoshitoki. History would call this speech Masako's greatest moment. The moment when a nun, a woman, a person who officially had no authority at all, held the government together through sheer force of personality and political genius. But here's what often gets overlooked. Masako was in her 60s when she gave this speech. In medieval Japan, that was ancient. Most people were dead by that age. Those who survived were infirm, retired, irrelevant. But Masako at 62 was sharper, more politically astute, and more powerful than she had been at any other point in her life. Age had not weakened her. If anything, it had strengthened her. She had decades of experience, an unmatched understanding of political dynamics, and the respect of an entire warrior class. She was, at this moment, probably the most powerful woman in the world. Not in title, not officially, but in practical terms. She ruled Japan, and everyone knew it. The years following Masako's speech were relatively peaceful. The Kamakura Bakufu was secure. The imperial court had accepted its subordinate role. The samurai lords were content with a system that protected their interests. But peace, for Masako, did not mean retirement. She continued to govern, to advise, to intervene in disputes. She met with provincial lords, adjudicated inheritance disputes, and managed the complex web of alliances that kept the Bakufu functioning. She also worked to ensure the Hojo clan's continued dominance. With no Minamoto heir available, the fiction that the shogun actually ruled was becoming increasingly thin. The shogun was a child puppet. Everyone knew the Hojo were the real power. This could have created resentment. And it did, in some quarters. But Masako had spent years building relationships, cultivating loyalty, demonstrating competence. Most samurai accepted Hojo dominance because the alternative was chaos. In 1224, Masako's brother Yoshitoki died. He had been regent for nearly 2 decades, the official head of the Hojo clan, the man who handled military and administrative matters while Masako managed politics. With his death, leadership passed to his son, Yasutoki, Masako's nephew. Yasutoki was capable, intelligent, and deeply influenced by his aunt. He had grown up watching Masako operate, learning from her, understanding that political power was as much about perception and legitimacy as about force. Masako, now in her late 60s, could have retired at this point. She had seen 3 generations of Hojo leadership. She had survived wars, coups, assassinations. She had buried her husband, her sons, her father, her brother. She had done more than any person could reasonably be expected to do. But she didn't retire. She continued to advise Yasutoki. She continued to meet with samurai lords. She continued to be Masako. Because here's the thing about power. Once you have it, it's almost impossible to give up, not because of ego, though that's part of it, but because the moment you step away, everything you've built becomes vulnerable. Masako understood that her presence was what held the system together. Her nephew was capable, but he didn't have her experience, her reputation, her authority, so she stayed, not as regent, not with any official title, but as the elder stateswoman, whose advice was sought by everyone, whose approval was necessary for major decisions, whose very presence lent legitimacy to the government. It's important to note that, by this point, Masako's role was essentially unprecedented in Japanese history. Yes, there had been powerful women before. Empress Jingu was said to have led a military conquest of Korea, though that story is probably mythical. There had been female emperors in the past. There had been mothers and wives of emperors who wielded significant influence. But Masako was different. She was not royalty. She had no imperial bloodline. She was the widow of a shogun and the mother of 2 dead shoguns. She should have been a footnote in history, a tragic figure who watched her family destroy itself. Instead, she had become the architect of a political system that would last for over a century. She had established Hojo dominance so thoroughly that her descendants would rule Japan for 6 more generations. She had proven that women could wield real political power, not just influence, but actual governance, if they were smart enough and ruthless enough to seize it. On August 16, 1225, Hojo Masako died. She was 69 years old, an extraordinary age for her time. She had outlived her husband by 26 years, her sons, her father, her brother, and most of her contemporaries. The exact cause of death is not recorded. Given her age, it was probably natural causes, perhaps an illness, or simply the accumulated weight of nearly 7 decades of life in medieval Japan. She died in Kamakura, in the city that her husband had built, surrounded by the government that she had shaped. She died as a nun, as a Matabutsu, officially removed from worldly affairs, dedicated to religious contemplation. But she also died as the Nun Shogun, the woman who had ruled Japan in all but name, who had shaped the course of Japanese history more profoundly than most emperors or official rulers. The Kamakura Bakufu mourned her death. Yasutoki, her nephew, arranged for elaborate funeral rites. Buddhist ceremonies were conducted. Memorial services were held. She was buried with honors befitting a person of extraordinary importance. Masako's story is more than just medieval Japanese history. It's about power and how we get it. It's about the choices we make when there are no good options. It's about surviving in systems designed to destroy us. It's about refusing to accept the limitations others try to impose. And it's about a truth that every society eventually has to learn. That human potential has nothing to do with gender. That brilliance and ruthlessness are not male qualities. And that given the opportunity, women are just as capable of ruling empires as men. Masako proved it in 13th century Japan. In a society that insisted women were powerless, in a world that tried to silence her at every turn, she chose her own path. She seized power no one was supposed to give her. She ruled Japan for a quarter century, and she did it all while wearing a nun's robes, supposedly removed from worldly affairs, officially powerless. The Nun Shogun. The woman who ruled Japan. The politician who never held office. The power behind the throne, who was more effective than most people who actually sat on thrones. Hojo Masako. Remember her name, because she deserves to be remembered. This has been Forgotten Heroes. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been taught about history. Keep digging deeper. Keep discovering that the past is so much richer, so much more diverse, and so much more interesting than anyone ever told you. Thank you for watching.